This Trilateral Global Summit continues to forge, create, and protect a culture of peaceful coexistence, probity, comity, and civility among the many business entities around the world. That culture of peace, however, is under threat with the ravages of COVID-19, where there is a desperate need to buttress and rejuvenate economies through processes of equitable international trading, the triggering of genuine inclusive economic activity, and the need to have small, vulnerable, and developing economies treated fairly and equally. One defining laudable objective of WHD and its founder, Dr. Abdul Basit Syed, is, and I quote, the focus on peace as an enabler of economic prosperity and human resilience for a post-pandemic world, promoting transparency and good governance, end of quote. It is through the institution of a fair trade cycle that both the global economy and peace will be strengthened. The new fiscal quest is one that searches for an economics of objective values grounded in the essence of our humanity. Just last week, the G7 summit was held in Cornwall, UK, and there was a shared consensual G7 agenda for global action. Among the mandates is a pledge to, and I quote, secure our future prosperity by championing freer, fairer trade within a reformed trading system, a more resilient global economy, and a fairer global tax system that reverses the race to the bottom. The communique promises further to support for the interests of the least developed and low-income developing countries, including in the full implementation of WTO rules to integrate into the world trading system so that any modernization of the global trading system supports the social and economic growth and development of these countries, end of quote. It is indeed refreshing that with the onslaught of this pandemic, that the G7 has formulated a communique very comprehensive in intent and sensitive to the pressing global challenges, but they must ensure it is not starved for action and implementation. Further, if they are committed to the spirit and philosophy of the communique, they must not treat the G193 countries as sidebar and adjuncts. And the G193 that I refer to is the 193 countries of the United Nations General Assembly. Any attempt to engage in a build back better philosophy as espoused must not be building back the same economic structures that operated to the advantage of the few and the miserly demise of the many. As we continue to strive to achieve the dictates of the United Nations 2030 Global Agenda with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, trade policies and frameworks must work in tandem with environmental policies and initiatives geared towards the realization of Goal 13, climate action. The United Nations states, and I quote, although trade is a source of income, jobs, and opportunities, it generates up 8 billion tons of climate heating, carbon emissions every year. In 2020, global CO2 emissions fell by 5.8% as measured to curb the COVID-19 pandemic, locked down many populations and economic sectors. But a steep uptick is expected as global trade rebounds from the crisis, end of quote. Therefore, if we are about building back better, an inclusive green economy becomes imperative, combining the tenets and mechanics of sustainable trading and progressive environmental practices. The UN Environment and Trade Hub, launched in 2015, continues to provide research, capacity building, and policy advisory services supporting countries who wish to leverage trade and investment as tools for achieving the SDGs and fulfilling their Paris Agreement commitments. Any discussion on international trade would invariably lead to an inevitable query whether the World Trade Organization, WTO, is fulfilling its mandate distilled by the Marrakesh Agreement. Since its adoption, which established a new global system of rules to regulate the conduct of international trade, there has been widespread expectation, especially among developing countries, that the 1994 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, would have allowed for greater and more effective participation of developing countries in international trade as compared to its predecessor, the 1947 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The question is whether the 1994 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the other agreements which now form part of the global legal regime, including the Agreement of Trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, have lived up to the expectation of reducing tension in trade or providing a peaceful environment for international trade, or has provided the enabling environment which would allow, according to the preamble of the Maastricht Agreement, and I quote, developing countries and the least developed among them secure a share in the growth in international trade commensurate with the needs of the economic developer. I respectfully submit that the noble intentions of WTO members, that the implementation of its mandate continues to fall short as many developing countries call for reform of the institution so that greater capacity building, for example, will be provided to them to engage more meaningfully in the sometimes very technical and complex legal issues and negotiations under international trade law. All is not, however, lost, and I'm encouraged by the utterances of the new Director General of WTO, Dr. Ngozi, not only the first African, but the first woman to head WTO. If the Director General is successful to reform the regime governing subsidies for fisheries, thereby addressing illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, as well as subsidies on fish granted by some industrial countries and others at large-scale fishers, which threaten the livelihood of fisher folks in SIDS, it would not only be a victory for the affected states, it would be consistent with the letter and the spirit of the WTO legal regime. The World Trade Organization Trade for Peace Network provides a platform that allows policymakers and experts from trade, peace, and humanitarian communities to explore the nexus between the multilateral trading systems, peace, and security. I speak to you from a small island development state perspective, understanding the intricacies and challenges of developing and burgeoning economies who are desperately trying to achieve a positive balance of payments through a regime of fair, just, and sustainable international trade. One of the targets of Goal 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure of the UN SDG is, and I quote, increase the access of small-scale industrial and other enterprises, in particular in developing countries, to financial services, including affordable credit and their integration into value chains and markets, end of quote. In this area, there's a void, an implementation deficit. Smaller economies are unable to compete and trade on scale simply because its production capacity is less, and therefore in leveraging competitive advantage must rely on quality. Quality production requires added emphasis and impetus on research and development and open innovation, OI, which is a cost and an investment firms have to endure. What SIDS are asking for is simply to be paid fairly for our products and services that cost firms a significant investment to produce. Consider, for example, the Trinidad variety of cocoa produced and developed in my country of Trinidad and Tobago. It is highly sought after by chocolatiers globally who are unwilling to pay the true cost and value of our brown gold. Trinidad cocoa is known as the world's finest cocoa hybrid and emerged from crossing between mixed Criollo and mixed Forastero varieties. Smaller economies must not be advantaged. With equitable trade and a fair pricing regime, it will result in poverty eradication and the enhancement of peace in these societies. Trade and fiscal assistance must be based on partnership, collaboration, cooperation, and not domination, not the vulnerability of the weak and the underdeveloped, and at times the obscene ascendancy of the strong and connected, but rather the responsible beneficence and fair treatment by the strong. Fiscal impunity has no place in a developmental international finance and trade that harbors visions of peace. As small island developing states, in this COVID-19 era, any proposition involving trade for peace must invariably respond to debt relief for countries so mired. The Caribbean continues to suffer tremendously from the ravages of COVID-19, especially with significant reliance on tourism industry and its trades ramifications. The World Economic Forum stated, and I quote, "Tourist-based economies like ours throughout the Caribbean region have limited social safety nets. This means our people, economy, and future are far more likely to be wrecked by COVID-19 than nations with more diversified economies. Today, airports and hotels here are shuttered. Unemployment throughout the region is soaring, and nobody knows when the tourism sector jobs may come back," end of quote. Therefore, debt relief must form part of the economic recovery conversation if we are serious about assisting the region in building back and doing so sustainably. I am aware, however, that this debt relief must not become a facilitator of corruption by dysfunctional governance. Finally, a discussion on trade for peace must encompass the efforts of women globally and their impacting influence on international trade. World leaders need to institutionalize equitable access to opportunity for women in the spheres of business, finance, and entrepreneurship to sustain progressive economic development. In 2018, the World Trade Organization Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment, it was highlighted that steps to empower women economically are happening slowly but not systematically. In the area of global trade, we have some small progress in helping women enter global markets, either directly or as part of global supply chains. Women are not less capable at exporting. Instead, they often lack access to information, finance, and technology. The problem is not that the exporter is female, but that the system is not attuned to ensuring women have the same access to these opportunities as men. And finally, I cannot forget our young people. Youth in inclusivity is critical to the proliferation of peace by engaging young minds in productive and progressive research and development. This results in the diminution of youth misfeasance and juvenile criminality. Youth and trade can provide moonshot ideas and innovative cutting-edge products and services for export if given the opportunities and tools for experimentation. Financial institutions are still very hesitant in investigating in the entrepreneurial skills and competencies of our young people. And regrettably, governments are just as lethargic in their policy implementation of same. It is prudent and commendable that WHD has the initiative of the Science Bazaar. That is, and I quote, to support and uplift youth development and showcase their innovative ideas and projects for the betterment of society. As we look forward to the end of this pandemic and the starting of our economies by way of vaccinations and global vaccine equity, the rule of law continues to be the key for sustainable trade and peace in the future. And the requisite authorities with oversight capacity must ensure that vulnerable economies receive their just due, and all countries adhere to accountability, transparency, and best practices in the conduct of global trade. I thank you very much.